Hey everybody, in this video we're going to be showing you a great method of painting an Ork boy of the Goff clan for Warhammer 40,000 by Games Workshop. Now, as one of the core troops of this particular faction, the way we're going to be painting this miniature is going to cover loads of different methods and techniques that can be applied to loads of different troops within it. So this includes things like knobs, storm boys, grots and more. And if you enjoy the video and you'd like to see more, then be sure to subscribe to our channel and also hit that notification bell to make sure you don't miss any videos. And if you really like it, then be sure to head over to duncanrhodes.com where you'll find our membership website that's packed full of loads and loads of videos just like this one, including a really in-depth guide on painting Ghazghkull Thraka, which, if you're collecting a Goff army, is a video you're going to want to see. Anyway, we hope you enjoy this one, and we'll see you at the desk. To paint your Goff boys, the first thing that you need to do is to undercoat your miniatures, and for this colour scheme what I recommend going for is a medium grey undercoat. So in this case I've gone for Mechanicus standard grey spray from Citadel, and this forms a great starting point for all the colours we're going to be using on the miniature, such as the clothing and of course that green skin. But on these models what we're going to be doing is starting out with the clothing, and when it comes to Goffs here what we need to do is look towards their main colours, which are black and white, in particular black. So here we're going to be concentrating on various shades of black for the clothing. Now we're not going to go for pitch black because that's reserved for the armour plating, which is much more distinctive as a pitch black when it comes to the Goff colour scheme. So what we're looking for here is kind of greyish brownish black sort of colours, so something in the region of Corvus black, and Corvus black is what I'm going to be starting out with, but any colour kind of like this will do just fine. So for example, Necromancer cloak from the Army Painter is also a great choice. Whatever you choose though, what you need to do is to get your palette and a largish kind of brush to apply it. I have here a regiment brush from the Army Painter, so ideal for these initial sorts of base coats. And with this, all we've got to do is, as ever, get some of this ready on the palette. So you just need to get a small amount of the paint, thin it down with a touch of water to make sure it's nice and smooth, bringing it down to around about this sort of consistency here, so you see it's flowing well from the brush. And then with this, all we need to do is pick out a particular part of the clothing and block it in. So it's up to you what you go for here. It could be jacket, trousers, anything like that. In this case, I'm going to be going for the shirt, so we're looking at this sort of area around here. And for this first colour, all we've got to do is block this detail in. It doesn't matter about anything else for the time being, because we'll neaten up as we add further base coats to the miniature. So for now, just pick that one area of clothing and block it in entirely. With that first colour now applied to the clothing, we can move on to another one because of course there's various layers that we need to do here, and depending on how many layers you've got in the miniature you might need to do more or less colours during this part of painting these off blacks. But in this case what we need to do now is paint the trousers, and for this what I've picked out is some Skavenblight Dinge. So again, a kind of sort of like dirty sort of black kind of colour, so ideal for the Goffs really. And to apply it, once again I'm going to go for that regiment brush because the application here is just the same as what we did in that previous stage. All we're looking to do is to block in this part of the clothing. Now when you're doing this, depending on the exact details of your miniature, you might need to be more careful or not, depending on what parts you're doing. In this case with the trousers, it's quite easy to block them in as we just paint in this area. Again, not worrying about the armour or anything like that because we're going to come to that later on. But whenever it does get close to the part we've done so far, just need to be a little bit more careful to make sure we only stay on the part that we want to block in. Now in addition, at this stage I'm going to pick out his gloves as well. So just around here, as before, not concerned about any details that we've not yet painted, just making sure I get this detail at this stage. I finished base coating in the trousers, and with that means we've now finished painting the various layers of clothing on this particular orc. But depending on which one you're doing, there might be a few more layers left to do, like a jacket and things like that. So again, just stick in this sort of ballpark of these sort of brownish blacks, and once you've done so, you're then ready to carry on with some other base coats on some smaller details. Now we're going to be starting out with all the leather belts and details here, and for this what I've got is some Mornfang brown, which is a nice warm brown. Nice contrast against the colder colours we've got on the miniature so far, so it's going to lift it all and make it pop a little bit more. And after that, we can start picking out some smaller details, starting out with the bone details, for which we need some Zandri dust, and then the inside of the mouth, here we need some Screamer pink. But first of all we need Mornfang brown, and to apply it I've now switched down to a medium layer brush from Citadel for a little bit more control. And with this now we just need to take care whilst applying it, so just make sure you thin your paint down so it's under control, and just approach this just assuming that you might have to do 2 coats of it, but having it thinner like this will give you much more control over the paint and much more accuracy, and it'll give a smoother finish as well, so it's definitely worth taking the time for it. So with that prepared, all we've got to do is just check the brush isn't overloaded, and then it's just a matter of looking for these details, and we're looking for all leather belts and straps. So for example these ones here going up over the shoulders, and you can see what I mean, it's a bit translucent, so it's just going to be a matter of applying a second thin coat once the first one's completely dry to get a nice smooth finish. In addition, I'm going to be painting any pouches and things that I can find, such as these ones just here, and the boots as well. Next up, we're ready to base coat any bone details in the miniature using Zandri dust, and in this case that's going to be things such as this skull that we've got at his side just down here, but also be sure to base coat in the teeth as well. And then finally, we just need a small amount of Screamer Pink to pick out the tongue, and this can be quite hidden away, so I've switched to a small layer brush for doing this, and it's just a matter of being as neat as possible. But if you do happen to catch the teeth, and don't worry about it, just neaten up with some Zandri dust before you continue. With those colours blocked in, the orc is now on his way to looking like an orc, but there's still a few more that we need to do, and what we're actually doing here is working through a whole host of base coats that can all take advantage of the same colour wash to give all of them some shading in one go, which is a very convenient, very quick and efficient way of painting units. That's why we're doing it for a regular orc boy just here. It's much, much quicker than shading each part individually as you go along, but there are still two more colours that we need to do before we do this brown wash on the miniature, and that's going to be the metallics. We're going to start out with some silver, for which I'm going to be using some Leadbelcher, and then to break up the large areas, we're going to introduce a bit of brass. Here I'm going to use some Balthazar gold. But first of all, we need that Leadbelcher, and to apply it I'm starting out with the medium layer brush, but I've got that small layer brush on hand for any smaller, more intricate details, because some of these can be quite tricky to get to, so having that smaller brush is very useful for that kind of thing. But for the majority of it, as ever, all you got to do is make sure your paint's nicely thinned down, and then it's just a matter of blocking these parts in. And at this stage we're looking for anything that we want to be metal, aside from the armour plating. So these plates here, we're going to do them black later on, so we don't need to worry about those, but we do want to get these little links that are connecting these plates, so areas such as just these around there, I want to make sure we just block them in at this stage. But also we're looking at the weapons too, and in this case I'm going to be painting the entirety of the pistol and the chopper as well. Once you've blocked in all that silver, you're then ready to break up some of the larger areas with some brass using Balthazar gold, and this is essentially to add a bit of interest to these details. So for example, the chopper, you can see it's just a big piece of silver. So what we're looking for is some small areas just to pick out with this colour. For example, the handguard just across here, and you can see it just gives a bit more variety to these details. Now it's entirely up to you how much of this you do, but it is usually going to be quite small areas, so definitely go for a small brush here. In this case I'm using a small layer brush, and you can see I'm just really taking my time making sure to pick out that detail as neatly as possible. I've finished adding in those tiny little bits of brass, and I'm happy with that for the variety it gives, and so now we're ready for the next step, which is to apply that wash that I mentioned. So in this case, what we need is a dark brown wash, which is going to benefit all the colours that we got on the miniature so far, and the colours after this, they wouldn't benefit quite so much, so that's why we're doing it now. In this case, I'm going to be using some Agrax Earthshade, but any dark brown wash will do. So for example, Strong Tone from the Army Painter is also a great choice. Whatever you choose to go for, what you need is a larger brush to apply it. So here I've got a monster brush from the Army Painter, and what I'm looking to do is to paint it all over the miniature at this stage, so I want a fair amount of this on the palette. Now I like to use a palette for this kind of thing because I can control how much I'm getting on my brush at once. You could go straight from the pot if you wanted to, but doing this just gives a little bit more control so you won't overdo it, because it is possible to put on too much of this. Likewise, it's possible to put on too little, so what I recommend you do is just load up a good amount on your brush and then pick a starting point. So for example, we could start on the leg around here, and all you do is just paint it all over so it settles in that recessed detail and stains all of it as well. And we're looking for about this amount of the application. So you see it's strong enough that I can see it mostly in the recesses. It's a little bit on the flat areas, but that's roughly what we want. So when it dries, that'll give some nice bit of shading. Now, when you are painting this on, you need to keep an eye out for how it's settling, because it is possible that too much of it will run and collect and start to build up in areas. And if it dries that way, it'll look a bit unpleasant. And I can see straight away a definite area where that's probably going to happen is around here. So parts that stick out tend to have a lot of that happening. And what I mean is if you paint this on like this and it starts to build up in that sort of way, you can see gravity has it running down and it starts to really kind of clump up and it looks quite horrible. So if you spot that happening, just touch your brush to it to absorb away the excess like a sponge and redistribute it elsewhere around the miniature. The wash is now completely dry, and you can see it's given that lovely shading to the miniature, and it has made a few details a little bit muddy, but don't worry about that because we are going to clean things up and brighten things up later on. But for now, what we need to do is turn our attention to the black armor panels, and we've done a few details that are close to black already, but this one, being pitch black, is the key one when it comes to the Goff color scheme. So this is for all the armor plating. What you need is a pitch black, so I'm going to use some matte black from the Army Painter for this, but if you want to stick to Citadel, then Abaddon black is the color to use here. And to apply it, I'm going to go for a small layer brush, but just just change brush as you need to, because the armor does vary quite a lot from model to model. If you're doing something in mega armor, then you'll definitely want a larger brush here. But for this, what we've got to do is just get some ready, thin down as ever on the palette, and then it's just a matter of looking around the miniature and blocking in all that armor. So for example, I've got these plates that are on the front of the body just here, and it's just a matter of just painting them in as neatly as possible, being really careful of all the other colours we've done so far as I'm applying this. So just very gently in areas such as that. Now, in addition, what I'm going to do with this colour is pick out some black on his gun as well, because it's quite a large area of silver. This armour plating on the side looks like a great candidate for being in the main colour scheme of the army. So I'm just going to block this in as well at this stage, though it's entirely up to you whether you do the same thing or not. Once you've got that even base coat done, the next thing we're going to do is to enrich the black a little bit by kind of shading it. Now, obviously with black, what we can't do is put a darker colour on there to shade it, because we can't really go darker than this. But what we can do instead is use a deep brown colour, which is going to give the same sort of appearance of helping key things out and give some depth to the black. It's also going to be some subtle weathering, which is ideal for orcs like this. And to do it, what we need is a nice dark warm brown. So I'm going to use some Rhinox hide here. And we also need some Lahmian medium, which will allow us to thin it down and effectively turn it into a wash. So that's what I've got here on the palette, these two. And you might be wondering at this stage, why not just use Agrax Earthshade for this? And it's because the mix that we're going to create here is going to be stronger, so we're going to see it better against that black. If we used Agrax Earthshade instead, then you simply wouldn't see it. So that's why we're going for this. So what we need to do is to create the mix, and just so you can see clearly what I'm doing, I'm going to start out with the Rhinox hide. So I just want a little bit of that on my palette. And then what I'm going to do is get some of that medium, just making sure my brush is clean so I don't contaminate it with any colour. And I am using a small layer brush for this, and you'll see why in just a moment. But what we need is a little puddle of this paint. So 1, 2, and 3 should be enough. I'm just bringing a little bit of that Rhinox hide and mix it together. And you can see here what we're doing is creating a really strong colour, a very strong kind of wash. And with this prepared, what we then need to do is to paint it into the recesses on those black details. So we're looking for things like scratches around rivets, things like that. So for example, if we take a look at this black armor panel that we've got on the back of him just here, we just want to start washing this into any little corners that we can find. So around those rivets that run around the edge where it meets those leather details, so there like that. And also we just want to run some of it into the chips. So areas such as just there and just here as well. Once that brown is completely dry, we can then move on to adding some highlights onto this black armor, because to get that sort of hammered texture that's ideal for orc armor, what we can do is some dry brushing. But because dry brushing can be a little bit messy and difficult to control, it's important that we do this now before we start highlighting and layering anything else, so that we can neaten up as we go along. So that's why we're doing it now, even though it's before we've base coated in the skin. So what we need is some Mechanicus standard grey, and go for a small dry brush. And I have a small dry brush here from Citadel. It's a new one as well, so the bristles are holding together quite nicely still. So what we need to do with this is just take advantage of that to get the control as we apply it. So just get a small amount of paint onto your brush, and on the tissue just start rubbing it into the bristles really, removing the excess paint and just making sure it's quite dry on there. And then with this, what we need to do is start identifying those black armor plates and look for the kind of the edges of them, and just angle your brush so you're brushing downwards over those edges. So you can see as I follow this circle round, I get that highlight appearing on the edge of it, and also a small amount of the paint is catching the flatter surface as well, giving that slightly rough texture to it. So ideal for that orc style armor. Now whilst doing this, you'll probably catch a few of the little details surrounding it, but don't worry about that. Because we're applying it in this controlled fashion, we can keep that to a minimum, and we'll neaten up as we add further colours onto the miniature. With that dry brush applied, you can see we've now got that nice rough highlight appearing on those black armor plates. And for a regular orc boy like this, you might just want to leave that there. But if you want to help those armor plates pop just a little bit more, what you can do is add a second highlight onto it with a lighter grey. And if you want to do this, what you need is some Administratum grey and that fine brush, so back to a small layer brush for this. And with this, what we're looking to do is to emphasize the sharpest points on the armor panels. So we're looking at things like corners, rivets, anything that stands out like that. So just need to make sure your paint's prepared for this by just adding that water to it to test to make sure it flows well from your brush. It doesn't need to be a very strong colour, it just needs to flow well, and then a really important thing to do is to make sure you don't have loads of it on your brush so that it doesn't run out of control. So you can see it looks like there's very little on my brush just there. But what I can do with this is approach those corners using the side of the brush and just gently skim along them. So this plate on his foot, for example, on his leg, what I'm going to do is just very carefully approach that corner and just skim it along like that to get that light colour catching that edge, and then angle the model so again I can approach using the side of the brush in that corner, and again just skim along to help pick it out. And then we've got that little rivet to pick out as well. So there you can see by doing that, it just helps that panel look a little bit sharper, but we also retain the texture that we got from the dry brushing. So once again, if we look at this panel on the back, we're looking for corners such as these little parts where it's got these little notches in there. We just want to angle the brush so we're about 45 degrees from the flat and just gently skim it along so we get a little bit of that lighter grey appearing on those edges to help it pop out a bit more. With that sharp highlight applied, you can see it just helps that black armour pop out a little bit more and just keys it out from the rest of the miniature. And so what we're going to do now is a little bit more highlighting, but this time again with dry brushing. So like before, the reason why we're doing this now is so that we can avoid making any big mistakes, and so we can easily neaten things up if any small mistakes happen as we add further colours to the miniature. So what we need now is some Necron compound, and what we're concentrating on is the large areas of metal. So again, we want that slightly hammered, worn appearance to them, so ideal for orcs. And to apply it, I'm using that small dry brush again that we used previously. And like before, what we need to do is just make sure we work the paint into the bristles and remove the excess so that there's not much left on there. So this is going to be applied very lightly so we have that control building up the colour to the point that we want it to be. So with that prepared, all we've got to do then is look for those edges and don't worry about the small details. So for example, these little links we've got on the armour, it's too difficult to get to those with a brush like this, so leave those. Instead, we're looking at larger parts like the blade of the chopper just here. And what we need to do is just angle the brush so we're going across those sharp edges, so just kind of following along there, and edges such as these corners along the back, just again flicking downwards, working our way across them. And this is to be applied over all the silver that you can get to easily like this, but also the brass as well. With that dry brushing done, you can see now we've got a really nice texture on those larger areas of metal, and what we're going to do now is move on to another detail, because now it's time to paint in that signature green skin of the orcs. Now there's loads of different tones of skin you can go for when it comes to orcs, but in this case what I'm going to go for is an olive green, which works really nicely amongst all of that black. And to do this, the first colour we need is some Deathworld Forest, and to apply it I'm going to be starting out with my small layer brush, but have a larger one on hand for the more larger open areas such as the main parts of the arms. But having a small brush like this is ideal to get started with for the more intricate details, because there's quite a bit that we need to paint around now. So set your paint up for that, making sure it's nicely thinned and smooth, and then we just got to start picking out all of that flesh. And you can see what I mean working around details such as on the face. You need to be careful of all the teeth as we're blocking all this in. And with this colour we will need 2 thin coats to ensure it's nice and even before moving on to the next stage. Bear in mind too, there are some quite intricate parts as you're doing this, especially around the shirt where there can be rips and tears and things, and for some of these sometimes you can see the skin through them, so just make sure just to poke in those areas too. With that green base coat applied, the orc is looking much more like an orc now, and we're ready to move on to the next step, which is going to be to provide some definition on that skin by applying a wash over it. So just like we did earlier on with all those black details and brown details. In this case though, what we need is a nice strong green, so I'm going to use some Biel-tan green for this, and to apply it I'm sticking to that small layer brush, though again you might want to have a medium layer brush on hand depending on how much skin is visible. It's really whatever you're comfortable with. But for this, definitely use a palette now to control how much is on your brush so that you don't overdo it, because when applying this, we need to keep it off everything that's not the skin. So as you're painting it onto his face, for example, just take your time as you're going around the mouth, just being careful not to get it onto the teeth. And you can see the way I do this is to deposit a load of the wash on an area such as around there, then just push it around, and this allows you to have that control because you're not really moving around too much at once. Now once you painted this all over the skin, give it about half an hour to dry, and then we're ready to move on to the next stage. Once that wash is completely dry, we can then move on to the next step, which is going to be to do some layering on the skin to brighten things back up and just reinforce that green a little bit. And for this, I'm going to use some Elysian green, applied again using that small layer brush. And now what we're looking to do is quite a controlled application where really we're looking for the raised up areas and we want to apply this colour to those parts only. So on your palette, you need to prepare for that. So thinning down the paint as ever to around about a sort of consistency just here so that it's nice and smooth. You see, it's a little bit translucent, but it's very easy to manipulate. So this way we have that control as to where exactly we want to put it. Because when painting it on now, you need to look carefully for those areas where more of that wash settled, where it's darker. So if we take a look at the face, you can see quite a lot of those areas now have been revealed, these kind of recesses and things. So when applying this colour, we essentially want to avoid those. So for example, if we go around the side of the mouth, we're looking at very carefully applying it to that sort of area there. and around here as we go down the jaw, but you can see there's a recess between the bottom of the jaw and that lower lip, so we want to retain that. So as you're applying this, look for wherever those darker lines are and basically just go around them. So along there like that, and you can see this way we're brightening up that skin once again, but also we're retaining that definition that we got from the wash. Now we just need to repeat doing this then across all of the flesh, and it's the same process throughout all of it, no matter what detail it is exactly that you're doing. So that includes the upper lip, where we just want to pick out those raised areas there. And on the muscles and the arms, you can see they're very well defined, these. Again, it's the same process of just looking for that raised up area, such as around this part right here, and this part along here, and avoiding that recess in between those areas. With that stage done, we've now got that lighter green appearing on the skin, and we've also retained all the definition from the wash. And that step can take a little bit of time, but just take your time with it, because this is one of the main features of Orks, of course. It really does pop out having that bright green on there compared to all that black. But once that is done, we can then move on to highlighting the skin, and for this I'm going to be using two colours. First of all, what we need is some Ogre and Camo, and then as an optional extra highlight, you can use some Screaming Skull. This might just be something you want to keep for characters. The choice really is yours, but we're going to do it on this miniature here to show you how to do it. But first of all, what we need is that Ogre and Camo, and to apply it I'm sticking to the small layer brush, because here what we want to do is to pick out the most defined features on the flesh, so anything that stands out, so things like the nose, the lips, that sort of thing. So you don't need loads of this paint to do this, you just need to make sure it's under control and you have that fine tip on your brush. And it's just a matter of looking for these areas. So if we take a look at the face first of all, as I mentioned, we're looking at things that stand out like the nose, and in this case we just want to use the tip of the brush just to very gently follow that crest around that little bit in the middle just there. Then we've got this texture on the upper lip, so we want to pick that out, and that means just painting these little vertical lines kind of following along the top of these parts, so just very gently along there. A little bit following the cheek, just picking that out, so just a little bit of that brighter green right there. But then also we want to follow it down around the mouth, so just as neatly as possible, just follow that line as it goes all the way around, right down here, and then to that lower lip. Now for the lower lip, we also want to create the impression of a bit of a texture there, so as you're going across this, do it again as little vertical lines, just sort of dot it along like that, and it gives the impression of that sort of rougher texture on there. So there we go, like that. Now when it comes to things like the muscles, where it's a bit larger and smoother, here what we're looking for is the area where the light would catch towards the top of it. So if we take a look at the arm on the inside just here, that means applying just a small amount of this colour just to this top, this kind of crest that we've got where light would catch coming down from the top there like that. And that's really all it needs. Just follow it around that rounded edge, just to round it off a little bit, and there we go. And the same is true on each of these muscles, just following all the way around each one. With that done, we can then move on to an optional extra fine highlight of Screaming Skull. And as I mentioned, this is entirely optional, something you might just want to reserve for your characters or squad leaders. But if you decide to do this, what we're looking to do is to pick out the very sharpest features with just a little bit of this colour to make them pop ever so slightly more. So for example, the bridge of the nose just there, and the brow sticks out a little bit, so I'm just going to add a little bit of this colour onto that part there. The tips of the ears are a great place to do this on as well, so just little bits like that. So you see, it's always very fine details that we just want to stand out ever so slightly more. With that final highlight applied, the skin is now complete, but we're not quite done with the face yet because we still need to paint in the eyes, which is what we're going to do now. And for this, we need two colours. First of all, a dark red to be the base coat for them. So here I'm going to use some corn red, and then we just need a dot of a bright red to make them pop out. And here we're going to use some Wild Rider red. But first of all, we need corn red, and to apply it again, definitely go for your small brush. Still using my small layer brush here. And we don't need a whole lot of this because, of course, the eyes are quite small. We just need to make sure we fill in the whole area with this colour. So just a small amount, thin down as ever, and then you just need to really brace your hands so you're nice and steady. So really make sure they're close together like this so that you aren't shaking, and then just move in, kind of going along the length of the eye. Gently go in and just apply this colour to the whole of the eyeball. Once that's done, you're then ready to move on to Wild Rider Red, and with this we just need to paint a little dot of it in the middle of the red that we previously did. So again, really brace your hands, go in from this angle of the eye and just dot a little bit of this colour in the very middle. And there we are, the eyes are painted in, and as you can see, that adds a lot of character to the miniature. And now we can move on to the next step, which is going to be a little bit of layering, just with some shabty bone, because now I need to lighten up all those parts that are bone coloured, so things like the skulls and also the teeth, of course. Now to apply this, still go for your small brush, back to that small layer brush just here. And what we're looking to do with this is to apply this kind of like what we were doing with the skin earlier on when we were using Elysian green. We're looking for those kind of flatter parts when we want to avoid the recesses. So for example, we take a look at the little skull that we've got down here. We're looking to kind of go for those flat parts. So that's going to involve going around the eye, sort of around here, a little bit on top of the nose, very gently over the teeth. And on the forehead, we just want to get the bit directly above the eye, then skip past that recess and carry on again on the other side. So this way you see it really helps bring that colour out and helps the detail stand out. Now when it comes to the teeth, what we're looking to do is again pick out that raised area, which means not going quite down to the base of them. It also allows us on quite wide teeth that are sculpted a bit like this one. What we can do is kind of hone it in a little bit more and make it appear a bit sharper by just applying the colour kind of in this sort of area just there. Those bone-coloured details are now standing out nicely, and if you wanted to, you could actually leave your orc here and just move on to basing the miniature and it'll look great on the tabletop. However, what we're going to do now is start highlighting all the various colours that appear on the model to help them pop out a little bit more. And if you want to do this, what we're going to do is start out by highlighting that clothing. Now the colours you pick here will vary depending on what exactly you've gone for when it comes to base coating the colours. So in this case, what we've got is black for the shirt. So what we need is a grey to highlight it. So that's what I'm going to go for here. I've got some Dawnstone, and to apply it again, I'm going to go for my small brush, so back to the small layer brush. And here what we're looking to do is, like with the skin really, when we're highlighting that, we just want to pick out the details that stand out. So we're kind of accentuating them, helping them jump out more from a distance. So to do that, just make sure your paint's flowing well from your brush and just play around with it on the palette just to test it to make sure it's kind of behaving a bit like what I've got here. See, it's flowing very easily from the brush, even though it doesn't appear like there's a whole load in the bristles themselves. So this way I've got that control over it. And then what we need to do is to first of all look for any edges on the shirt. So if we look around his sleeve just here, we just want to approach using the side of the brush and just very gently skim across that edge so we get that light colour just catching along there like that. But also we want to look for any creases such as these ones just here, and at the very peaks of them, just paint along those as well. And you can see for this, the motion I've adopted is going in a kind of downward sweeping motion towards myself, because this gives a lot of control and a lot of accuracy, because you just kind of maneuver the model around so you're painting that comfortable motion, and this gives you a nice natural highlight following along that edge. I've finished applying that highlight onto the shirt now, and so we can move on to the next part of the clothing, which is going to be the trousers. And here I'm actually going to go for a khaki colour, because if we just stuck to greys for all the highlights for these clothes, because they're all sort of shades of black, it will all look very samey. So by using some khakis instead, what you can do is add a nice bit of variety to things and mix it up a little bit. So the colour I'm going to use here is Carrick Stone, and again to apply it I'm using the small layer brush, because essentially the application here is going to be just the same as what we did in that previous step. We're once again looking for any parts that stand out, so the peaks of any creases, the edges, things like that, and we just want to follow along with them. So prepare your paint for that, just testing the tip of the brush just to make sure it's flowing well from it and that you have that control, and then we're looking for those sharper parts. So for example, we'll be looking at things that are emerging through, such as his knee just there, and you can see we've got a line for it. So I'm just going to turn the model so I'm comfortable and do that downward painting motion and just apply a little bit of this colour along there to get that highlight on the knee right there. We've also got a few creases going in here, and again, just turn the model as you need to so that you're comfortable so you can access these parts, but it's again just a matter of following along all those edges. Now, because I also base coated the gloves at the same time as I did the trousers, I'm going to be highlighting those too in the exact same way. And with that, the trousers are highlighted too, as well as the gloves. And at this stage, if you have any more layers of clothing with, again, different sorts of shades of off black, just carry on highlighting those in the same sort of way, just picking a light colour appropriate to whatever it is that you're highlighting. But once that's done, we can then move on to highlighting the smaller details. And for this, we're going to start with all that brown leather. And here I'm going to use some tusk or fur. After that, we can highlight the tongue. And for this, what we need is a little bit of pink horror. And then finally, what we need to do is to highlight the teeth. And here, what we need is some screaming skull. But first of all, we need that tusk or fur, and to apply it again, I'm going for the small layer brush because once again, I'm looking for those sharper edges on these details. So it's just a matter of getting the paint ready for that task, bringing it down to about this point here. You see, not too thin, so it's not too runny, but also not too thick either because we want it to flow well from the brush. And then with this, what we're looking for is the edges on these brown details. So for example, if we look at the boots, we're looking at creases and things such as just along here, and it's just a matter of following those raised up areas just very gently with a little bit of this colour to help them pop out, including around the top as well, just following along where it meets the trousers. Where it comes to all the belts, for these, the easiest way I find to highlight these is to again angle it so you're painting in that downward motion towards yourself. Just look for that edge and just gently skim along it. So we're looking at this sort of area along here. The next colour we need is pink horror, and this is to highlight his tongue. And for this, all we need to do is apply a small amount of this colour just going to the very tip, so kind of a V shape. And then finally, we just need a small amount of Screaming Skull to highlight all the bone details. In the case of the teeth, that means just doing a few lines, just coming down from the tips of them, just to give the impression of that sharpness at the very point of them. So there, like that. And in the case of things like the skull around here, we're just looking for those defined features, such as around the nose, around the eye sockets, anything like that that stands out. Once those teeth have been highlighted, you're then ready to move on to highlighting 2 more details before we start moving on to some optional extras, and that's going to be the metallics now. And for this, we need some silver first with some Stormhost silver, and then the bronze details we're going to highlight using Psychorax bronze. But first of all, we need some Stormhost silver, and again to apply it, I'm using the small layer brush, and once again we're looking for the sharper edges, but here we can also add a little bit of texture on the chopper blade by just doing a few little scratches and things on it. So to do that, as ever, make sure your paint's nicely thinned and just adjust it as you need to, bringing it to about this sort of point here, again flowing really nicely from the brush and also making sure the brush isn't overloaded. And here we're once again looking to edge highlight these details. So for example on his pistol just here, we just want to use the side of the brush just to skim along those sharper edges to get that bright highlight going all the way around. So really neatly around there like that. And when it comes to the chopper, we want to do the exact same thing, following that sharp cutting edge. So just edging it all the way along there like that. And also on the back of the blade, but we also want to do a highlight on the cutting part of it too. So that means this kind of angle that we've got that the Drybrushing has revealed. So to do that, again, just angle the model so you're painting downwards and towards yourself and just follow the peak of that line. So we want to go just along there and then change the angle so we can follow it down here and a little bit on here as well. And then finally, we just want to give the impression of a few scratches and cuts and things on the blade as if it's been used. So to do this, all you got to do is, again, make sure you don't have much paint on your brush and just kind of flick downwards in the direction of the blade. So kind of like that, allowing that paint just to pick up in a natural kind of manner. And this way you get that nice sort of scratched effect on the cutting edge of the blade. And once you're finished with the silver, you can then move on to the bronze details using Psychorax bronze. And to highlight these, we just need to do the exact same technique, once again just approaching very gently with the side of the brush to pick out those edges. And with that, all the details on this orc are now highlighted, but there is one important detail missing because so far we haven't got any white on there or any checks. So what we're going to be doing is doing both those things at the same time now. And for this, we're going to start out by marking anything that we want to be white using some Dawnstone. And then after that, we need to take it up much closer towards a white. So here I'm going to use some Pallid Witch Flesh. Then to finish off, I'm going to highlight it using some matte white from the Army Painter. But first of all, we need some Dawnstone. And the reason I'm using this is, well, there's actually 2 reasons really. First of all, it provides a good base coat for the Pallid Witch Flesh later on as we move much closer to white. But when freehanding in the middle markings like the little checks and things, this is actually a really good colour for it, because if you make any mistakes, it's very easy to rectify them from this. Much easier than it would be if you went to a much stronger white straight away. So it's a nice in between kind of colour. So you just need to prepare it as ever and kind of go into it preparing it as if you're going to be edge highlighting it, because some of this technique is going to be very similar to that. So I'm going to start out with a little bit of freehanding. So for the checks, first of all, pick whereabouts where you want them to be. And in this case, I'm looking at this little panel on his leg just here. And we want to start it out by creating a grid on here. So to do that, I divide it in half. So we want a little vertical line just running down there like that. And then we want to turn the model and do another line dividing this in half. So we want to kind of go along here. So very gently all the way down. Now those squares are a little bit too big at this stage for the check pattern, so I'm just going to break them up again. So I'm going to split either side in half. So we want another vertical line, so right in there. And there we go. And then we need another one on the other side of it. So that's going to be just here. So remember, always that downward motion, just using the tip of the brush, just letting it run along, and there we go. So with that grid established, we then know where the white markings are going to be, so we can just start colouring those in using the grey. So for example, I'm going to start on this one right here. So all we want to do is just block that in, and then go to this one, and then this one down here, and then finally that one on the top left. So there we go. So we want to do a second coat after this one's dry, just to make sure the colour's nice and even. But you see, by doing that, it's quite easy to create and mark out where that check pattern is going to go. Now, one other thing to look for here is really anything else that you want to be white. And normally glyphs are a great thing to go for. There's only one on this particular miniature, which is on the side of his pistol, but I'm going to block that in at this stage. So we're looking at this little glyph just here. Once you're happy with the pattern and have neatened up anything that you might need to, the next thing to do is to move on to Pallid Witch Flesh, and with this we just need to trace directly over that grey, so this way we're bringing it much closer to white. Once you have an even coat of that colour, the last thing we need to do is to highlight these details using some matte white. And in this case, we're just looking at the white and it's an edge highlight like we were doing earlier on, just very carefully around these white parts. Now you might be thinking that these parts here aren't actually fully white now, they're an off-white with a pure white highlight, and that's exactly what we want because this is going to give the appearance of it being a pure white, and also it allows us to highlight it, giving that nice clean finish to these details. And there we are, we've got the check pattern on there, and also we've got a white glyph on the back of his gun there as well. And you can really do as much of that as you want to, but once you have done with it, what we can do is add a few weathering effects onto the miniature to finish it off and really bring out that character of the Orks, because of course their weapons and equipment are going to be quite rusty and quite damaged. So we're going to start out with some rust, and for this I'm going to be using two colours. First of all, we're going to return to Mornfang Brown, and then we're going to add a very small amount of Scrag Brown over the top. But first we need Mornfang Brown, and to do this kind of rust effect with this paint, all you need to do is get a small amount using your small brush. Still using my small layer just here, and then we want to heavily water it down, so really thin it down with a good amount of this, bringing it right down to this sort of point here. So you see it's very runny, and then with this just load up a small amount on your brush and just look for areas where rust would collect. So for example, if we look at these armor plates just here, we'd get them sort of settling around rivets and things, so all you do is just wash it on like that, letting it just run as it will and collect mostly in the corners, so areas like that. So I'm going to be doing this onto the black armor panels. I'm also going to do some onto the silver, such as around here on his pistol, so little areas like that. And also we can do a little bit of it sort of smearing over onto the white as well. Once you finish that step, you're then ready to move on to Scrag Brown, thinned down in the exact same way as what we've just done. And with this, all we're looking to do is to add a few little smaller dots of this colour into the areas that we stained with that brown. And this will be the fresher, brighter rust just in the middle of these areas. And with that, we've now added the rust to the miniature, and so we can move on to the final effect, which is going to be some scratches onto those armor plates. And for this, all we need to do is return to some Leadbelcher, and to apply it, still go for that small brush, so it's back to the small layer brush here. And with this, all we're looking to do is a kind of rough application of this colour, but very delicately applied. So we're kind of just putting little points of it, really, but just want to be random in exactly how we apply it to the edges of panels. So get your paint thin down to about this sort of point here, as though you're going to be edge highlighting, and really make sure that you don't have much paint on your brush there. And so with this, what we're looking to do for these black armor panels that we've got, and any white ones too, is just gently start just dotting a little bit of this just along some of those edges like that at random, just so rough little highlight almost, just to give a few little scratches going on those parts. And also just bring a few little bits onto the flat of the panel, and then some occasional little dots in line with that, just to give a few little scratches, just to make it look a bit more weather worn there like that, just very delicately to get that nice impression. Now once done this, your miniature is ready to be based, and as ever it's entirely up to you how you base it, but in this case I'm going to go for a desert base, so a nice light one which will contrast nicely against a dark colour scheme like this. And with the base now fully painted, this Ork boy is complete and ready to join the Waaghhhh. So as you've seen when painting this colour scheme, a good thing to do very early on is to get hold of a selection of kind of off grey, brown, sort of like blackish kind of colours, and just vary between these as you're painting in the various layers of clothing on your miniatures. The parts to keep consistent though are the black and white details on the armour, and remember when you're doing the white parts, in particular those checks, be sure to base coat them using a grey first of all, because this is very easy to fix should any mistakes happen. And once you're happy with the layout of the pattern, then just go over the top of it with an off-white and then highlight with a pure white beyond that. So have fun painting your Goffs, and we'll see you again very soon.